Sometimes the most broken souls recognize each other across species. Sometimes healing comes not from conquering, but from understanding. In 1887, Colorado Territory, a wild beast called Ghostfang terrorized the mountains near Dead Horse Pass. Half dog, half wolf, it had defeated every man who tried to tame it. Ranchers feared it. Trappers cursed it. Those brave enough to face it came back bloodied or didn't come back at all. For 3 years, no rope could hold it, and no cage could contain it. The creature roamed free, leaving destruction in its wake. Everyone said it was impossible to tame. But when the beast began stalking closer to town, broken mountain man Ezra Cade stepped forward. While others saw a monster, Ezra saw something different in those yellow eyes, the same pain that stared back at him every morning in the mirror. Could a man who'd lost everything reach the heart of something everyone else had given up on? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the pine trees like old memories, refusing to let go. Ezra Cade stood on the narrow porch of his log cabin, watching the sun struggle through the Colorado Territory's mountain peaks. At 53, his weathered hands wrapped around a tin cup of bitter coffee, he looked like a man carved from the same stone as the mountains themselves, hard, enduring, and worn smooth by years of solitude. His cabin sat perched on a rocky ledge 8 miles north of Pinewood, accessible only by a treacherous deer path that discouraged visitors, which suited Ezra just fine. The last thing he wanted was company. The cabin itself told the story of a man who'd stopped caring about comfort long ago. One room, a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, and a bed that creaked with every movement. No decorations, no photographs, nothing to remind him of what he'd lost, except for the small wooden horse. It sat on the windowsill, carved from pine with the careful attention of a father's hands. Tiny details marked every surface, the flowing mane, the proud arch of the neck, even miniature bridle straps etched with a pocket knife. The toy was no bigger than Ezra's palm, but it carried the weight of a world that no longer existed. He'd made it for his son, Thomas, during the winter of 1882. The boy had been 5 years old then, with sandy hair that caught sunlight like spun gold, and a laugh that could chase away the darkest storm clouds. Thomas had carried that little horse everywhere, making galloping sounds as he ran through their house in Denver, pretending to be a great cavalry officer leading charges against imaginary enemies. Now Thomas was buried in a cemetery Ezra would never visit again, and the horse sat silent on a windowsill, gathering dust like everything else in Ezra's deliberately empty life. The accident had been 5 years ago, though some days it felt like yesterday. Other days it felt like a lifetime. Ezra had been sheriff of Arapahoe County then, a position he'd held with pride and purpose. He'd believed in justice, in protecting the innocent, in making the world safer for families like his own. That belief had died the same day as his boy. The outlaw's name was Marcus Kane, wanted for bank robbery and murder across 3 territories. Ezra had tracked him for weeks, finally cornering him in a warehouse on the outskirts of Denver. Kane had surrendered without a fight, hands raised, weapon dropped. It should have been the end of the story, but Ezra had made a mistake. One moment of misplaced mercy, one decision to trust that a man begging for his life wouldn't try anything desperate. He'd loosened Kane's bonds slightly during transport, responding to the man's claims that the ropes were cutting off circulation to his hands. It was a kindness that cost everything. Kane had broken free during the transfer, stolen Ezra's own service revolver, and escaped into the Denver streets. 3 days later, driven by rage and a twisted sense of revenge, Kane had broken into Ezra's home while the sheriff was out on another case. He'd found Martha in the kitchen and Thomas playing in the sitting room. The neighbors said they heard 2 gunshots. When Ezra came home that evening, he found them both lying in pools of blood, the wooden horse clutched in Thomas's small fingers. Kane was never caught. He'd vanished like smoke into the vast Western Territories, leaving behind only destruction and a broken man who could no longer bear to wear a badge. The townspeople of Denver had been understanding at first. They'd attended the funeral, offered condolences, even suggested that Ezra take time to heal before returning to duty. But Ezra knew better. He'd seen the questions in their eyes, the unspoken blame. If the sheriff couldn't protect his own family, how could he protect theirs? So he disappeared into the mountains, carrying nothing but essential supplies and the weight of his failures. For 5 years, he'd lived on these heights, trapping enough game to survive, trading pelts once a month in Pinewood for coffee, flour, and ammunition. The townspeople knew him only as the strange hermit who appeared like a ghost at Thompson's general store, conducted his business in silence, and vanished back into the wilderness. They whispered about him naturally. Some said he was touched in the head. Others claimed he was dangerous, a man whose grief had twisted him into something unpredictable. A few of the older residents remembered hearing stories about a sheriff in Denver who'd lost his family, and they suspected the truth. But no one ever asked directly. Ezra preferred it that way. Questions meant conversation, and conversation meant explaining things he couldn't bear to put into words. Better to be known as the crazy mountain man than the father who'd failed to save his child. His daily routine never varied. Rise before dawn, check the trap lines, gather firewood, maintain his equipment. Every task performed with the methodical precision of a man trying to keep his mind occupied. He'd learned that idle thoughts led to dangerous places, memories of laughter, of small arms wrapped around his neck, of bedtime stories and promises he couldn't keep. The only time he descended toward civilization was for supplies, and even then he timed his visits to avoid the busiest hours. Thompson's general store on Tuesday mornings, when most folks were busy with their own affairs. Quick, efficient transactions conducted in monosyllables. Pay for what he needed, load his pack, and retreat back to his mountain solitude. But lately, those trips had become increasingly tense. Pinewood was afraid. The town nestled in a valley between towering peaks, surrounded by dense forests that had always provided both beauty and isolation. Founded 15 years earlier by optimistic families seeking fresh starts, it had grown into a modest community of maybe 200 souls. They had a church, a school, Thompson's store, a small saloon, and the kind of quiet streets where children could play without worry. Until Ghostfang arrived. The name itself had taken on mythical proportions over the past 3 years. Some claimed the beast stood 4 feet at the shoulder, with jaws that could snap a man's leg like kindling. Others swore they'd seen yellow eyes glowing in the darkness, watching from the tree line with an intelligence that was almost human. What everyone agreed on was that the creature was unlike anything they'd encountered before. Larger than any dog, more cunning than any wolf, and possessed of a viciousness that seemed personal rather than instinctual. It had killed livestock, destroyed property, and injured several men who tried to hunt it down. Old Pete Morrison, the town's most experienced tracker, had organized 3 separate expeditions to find and kill the beast. Each time, they'd returned empty-handed, with tales of tracks that vanished on rocky ground and a quarry that seemed to anticipate their every move. The last expedition had ended with 2 men requiring stitches, and Pete himself declaring the animal smarter than most folks I know. The descriptions varied depending on who was telling the story, but certain details remained consistent. The size, enormous, somewhere between a large dog and a small bear. The coloring, dark gray with black markings that made it nearly invisible in shadows. The eyes, yellow as molten gold, filled with an intelligence that unsettled even hardened men. Most disturbing of all were the reports of its behavior. This wasn't a rabid animal acting on instinct. Ghostfang seemed to choose its targets deliberately, striking when least expected, and always managing to escape before help could arrive. It had developed a reputation for being untouchable, a phantom that haunted the mountain passes and left fear in its wake. During his supply runs, Ezra had overheard countless conversations about the beast. Men speaking in low voices about reinforcing chicken coops and keeping children closer to home. Women sharing worried glances when the topic arose. Even the town's minister had taken to including prayers for protection in his Sunday sermons. Ezra had listened to it all with the detached interest of someone observing a drama that didn't concern him. He lived far enough from town that Ghostfang's activities seemed like distant thunder, troubling to others, but not his problem. His own mountain was steep and rocky, offering little of interest to a predator that seemed to prefer easier targets in the valleys below. Besides, he had enough ghosts of his own to wrestle with. He didn't need to take on the town's monster as well. But as he stood on his porch this particular morning, something felt different. The forest was too quiet. Birds that usually filled the dawn air with chatter had fallen silent. Even the wind seemed muted, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. Ezra's instincts, dulled by years of isolation but not completely dead, began to stir. Something had changed in the delicate balance of his wilderness sanctuary. Something large enough and dangerous enough to silence the natural world. He stepped back inside the cabin and reached for his rifle, a well-maintained Winchester that had served him faithfully through years of hunting and protection. The weapon felt familiar in his hands, a reminder of skills he'd hoped never to use again. As he checked the ammunition and slung the rifle across his shoulder, his eyes fell once more on the wooden horse. For just a moment, he allowed himself to remember the sound of Thomas's voice, excited and breathless as he described the adventures his toy horse was having. Then he pushed the memory away, stepped out into the silent morning, and began walking down the mountain toward whatever was coming. The scream that shattered Tuesday morning's peace in Pinewood would echo in Ezra's memory for years to come. He was halfway down the mountain trail when it reached him, high, terrified, and unmistakably that of a child. The sound cut through the forest silence like a blade, followed immediately by shouting voices and the sharp crack of a rifle. Ezra broke into a run, his boots finding purchase on the rocky path with the sure-footedness of a man who'd spent 5 years navigating these slopes. The sounds were coming from the eastern edge of town, where the settlement met the tree line. As he crested the final ridge, he could see people running toward a small farmhouse, their movements frantic and purposeful. By the time he reached the scene, a crowd had gathered in the yard of the Henderson place. Women were ushering children away, while men stood in a tight circle, their faces grim. Dr. Patterson knelt beside something on the ground, his medical bag open, hands moving with practiced efficiency. "Sarah, honey, you're safe now?" he was saying in the gentle voice he used for frightened patients. "Just lie still while I look at these scratches." Ezra pushed through the crowd until he could see what had happened. Sarah Henderson, 8 years old with brown braids and enormous blue eyes, lay on a blanket someone had brought from the house. Her left arm was bandaged, and her dress, a cheerful blue calico with tiny white flowers, was torn in several places. The largest tear ran from her shoulder to her waist, the edges jagged and stained with blood. What happened here? Ezra's voice cut through the murmured conversations, and several heads turned toward him in surprise. Most of the townspeople recognized him by sight, but few had ever heard him speak. Tom Henderson, Sarah's father, looked up from where he knelt beside his daughter. His face was pale with shock and dark with fury. "That damn beast," he said, his voice shaking. "Ghostfang. It came right into our yard, bold as brass, while Sarah was feeding the chickens. I heard the commotion and came running," added Mrs. Henderson, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Found that monster standing over her, just staring. When it saw me, it took off toward the woods, but not before." She gestured helplessly at her daughter's torn clothing. Dr. Patterson finished his examination and sat back on his heels. "She's lucky," he announced to the crowd. "The scratches are shallow, more like warning marks than a real attack. If that animal had meant serious harm, we'd be having a very different conversation." "Warning marks?" Tom Henderson stood up, his hands clenched into fists. "You're saying it was playing with her?" "I'm saying it could have killed her easily and chose not to," the doctor replied calmly. "That doesn't make it less dangerous, but it might mean something." Ezra studied the torn fabric of Sarah's dress, noting how the tears followed clean lines rather than the random shredding that would come from a frenzied attack. The creature had been deliberate, controlled. That level of restraint suggested intelligence and perhaps something else. Where exactly did this happen? He asked. Tom pointed toward a small wooden coop 20 yards from the house. Right there by the chicken pen. Sarah goes out every morning to scatter feed. Never had trouble before, not even with foxes or coyotes. Ezra walked over to the area, ignoring the curious stares that followed him. The ground around the coop told a clear story to someone who knew how to read tracks. Massive paw prints in the soft earth, much larger than any domestic dog. The spacing between them indicated a creature moving at a walk, not running or stalking. It had approached openly, without attempting stealth. More interesting were the chicken tracks. The birds had scattered naturally, but not in the panic pattern he'd expect from a predator attack. They'd moved away but not fled entirely. Some had even returned to peck at scattered grain while the confrontation was happening. Has anyone seen hide or hair of this beast before today? Ezra called back to the crowd. Old Pete Morrison caught sight of it near Widow's Creek last month, someone answered. Said it was watching him from across the water, just standing there like it was studying him. My husband saw tracks by our well 2 weeks ago, added another woman. Fresh ones, like it had come right up to the house in the night. Ezra nodded, pieces of a puzzle beginning to form in his mind. This wasn't random predation. Ghostfang was scouting, learning, perhaps even testing boundaries. But for what purpose? We need to organize another hunting party, Tom Henderson declared, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. This has gone on long enough. That thing nearly killed my daughter today. Nearly killed her. Dr. Patterson shook his head. Tom, I understand you're upset, but let's be accurate about what happened. Sarah has some scratches and a torn dress. She's frightened, but she's not seriously injured. This time, Tom shot back. What about next time? What if it decides to stop giving warnings? Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Ezra could see the fear in their faces transforming into something more dangerous, the kind of determination that led to hasty decisions and tragic mistakes. Hunting. Parties haven't worked before, he said quietly. But his words carried in the morning air. 3 expeditions, no results. What makes you think a 4th will be different? You got a better idea, Cade? The challenge came from Jake Murphy, the town's blacksmith, and a man not known for patience. Or are you just here to watch the show? Ezra met Murphy's hostile stare without flinching. I've been tracking animals in these mountains for 5 years. I might have a different approach. Different how? This from Mayor Williams, a thin man with intelligent eyes who'd been quietly observing the exchange. Most folks have been treating this like a hunting problem, Ezra replied. Track it down, corner it, kill it. But this animal isn't behaving like normal prey. It's smart, it's cautious, and it seems to be studying human behavior as much as humans are trying to study it. So what are you suggesting? Dr. Patterson asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. Ezra was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving from the torn dress to the tracks by the chicken coop to the faces of the frightened townspeople. Everything inside him wanted to walk away, to return to his mountain sanctuary and leave these people to solve their own problems. He'd learned the hard way that getting involved in other people's troubles only led to more pain. But then he looked at Sarah Henderson, still lying on the blanket with her wide, scared eyes, and something shifted inside his chest. Something he'd thought was dead began to stir. The protective instinct that had once driven him to become a lawman. The paternal feelings that had made him a devoted father. I think maybe this animal needs understanding more than it needs killing, he said finally. Something drove it to this behavior. Wild animals don't usually get this close to human settlements without good reason. You want to try to understand a monster. Jake Murphy's voice dripped with disbelief. I want to try to solve this problem in a way that doesn't get anyone else hurt, Ezra replied evenly. Including the animal. A shocked silence fell over the crowd. Tom Henderson was the first to break it. You're talking about my daughter, Cade. That thing attacked my little girl. No, Ezra said, his voice gaining strength. It marked your little girl. There's a difference. If Ghost Fang had wanted to kill her, she'd be dead. Instead, she's scared but safe. That tells me this animal is trying to communicate something, not hunt. Communicate what? Mayor Williams asked. Ezra looked around at their skeptical faces, knowing he was about to propose something they'd consider madness. I won't know until I try to find out. But I'm willing to track this creature alone and see if there's another way to handle this situation. Alone. Dr. Patterson frowned. That's incredibly dangerous. Less dangerous than sending an armed mob into the mountains, Ezra countered. This animal has avoided every hunting party so far. It knows these hills, it's faster than you are, and it's shown it can disappear when it wants to. But it's also shown restraint. That gives me something to work with. The crowd erupted into arguments, some supporting the idea of trying a different approach, others insisting that the only good solution was a dead Ghost Fang. Through it all, Ezra stood quietly, his mind already working out the logistics of tracking an intelligent predator that didn't want to be found. When the voices finally died down, Mayor Williams stepped forward. How long are you asking for, Cade? 2 weeks, Ezra replied. Give me 2 weeks to see if I can make contact with this animal and figure out what it wants. If I can't make progress by then, you can organize all the hunting parties you want. And if it hurts someone else in the meantime, Tom Henderson demanded. Ezra looked down at the torn piece of blue calico fabric at his feet, stained with blood, but not soaked in it. A warning, not an attack. A message, not murder. Then I'll track it down and kill it myself, he said quietly. But I don't think that's what's going to happen. Back in his cabin that evening, Ezra spread his tracking gear across the rough wooden table like a general planning a campaign. Rope, dried meat, his skinning knife, extra ammunition, a compass, and a small telescope he'd acquired years ago for spotting game at distance. Everything a man needed to survive in the wilderness while pursuing something that didn't want to be found. As he worked, organizing supplies with methodical precision, his hands moved with automatic efficiency while his mind wandered to places he usually kept locked away. The way Sarah Henderson had looked lying on that blanket reminded him too much of another child, another time when his protection had failed. He reached for his pack and his fingers brushed against something small tucked into a side pocket. Without thinking, he pulled out a pair of tiny leather gloves, brown and soft, sized for a 5-year-old's hands. His breath caught in his throat. He'd made these gloves for Thomas during the winter before everything went wrong. The boy had wanted to help with the wood chopping, insisting that he was old enough to use tools like his father. Ezra had compromised by teaching him to stack kindling, but only if he wore proper protection for his small hands. The memory hit him with unexpected force. Thomas, so serious and determined, struggling to hold the miniature work gloves steady while Ezra helped him slip them on. "Now I can work like Papa," the boy had said with such pride in his voice that Ezra had to turn away to hide his smile. Patience. "Thomas," Ezra had told him that day, watching his son carefully arrange pieces of wood in neat piles. "Animals and tools both require patience. Rush either one and somebody gets hurt." Thomas had nodded solemnly, as if receiving sacred wisdom. "Patience, Papa, I'll remember." But patience hadn't saved him when Marcus Kane came calling. All the careful lessons about gentleness and understanding hadn't protected a small boy from a madman's revenge. Ezra tucked the gloves back into his pack, forcing himself to focus on the present. He'd given his word to the people of Pinewood, and despite his years of isolation, that still meant something. More importantly, he couldn't stand by and watch fear consume another community the way guilt had consumed him. The next morning, he set out before dawn, following the trail from the Henderson place into the dense forest beyond. Ghost Fang's tracks were easy enough to follow at first. The creature had made no effort to hide its path as it departed from the scene. Deep impressions in the soft earth showed a steady gait, not the frantic scrambling of an animal fleeing in panic. Ezra paused frequently to study the signs, reading the story they told with skills honed by years of solitary hunting. The spacing between prints remained consistent, indicating an animal walking with purpose rather than wandering aimlessly. Occasionally, the tracks would stop entirely, usually near fallen logs or large boulders that offered vantage points overlooking the surrounding terrain. "You were watching," Ezra murmured to himself, examining one such spot where the ground showed clear signs of an animal sitting for an extended period. Watching and learning, the trail led steadily upward into terrain that grew increasingly rugged. Dense pine forests gave way to rocky outcroppings and steep ravines that would challenge even an experienced climber. Yet Ghostfang had navigated the difficult ground with apparent ease, leaving only occasional paw prints where the creature had crossed patches of soft soil between the stones. By midday, Ezra had climbed high enough to look back down at Pinewood nestled in its valley far below. From this elevation, he could see the pattern of farms and homesteads spread across the landscape like a patchwork quilt. Anyone or anything positioned up here would have a commanding view of human activities in the settlement. The implications made him thoughtful. This wasn't just an animal passing through territory. Ghostfang had chosen this vantage point deliberately, studying the humans below with the patience of a military scout. The afternoon brought new challenges as the trail became more difficult to follow. Ghostfang had begun moving across bare rock more frequently, leaving only occasional scratches and disturbed pebbles to mark its passage. Ezra found himself relying more on intuition than physical evidence, trying to think like his quarry. Where would an intelligent animal go to find shelter? Water, food? Most importantly, where would it go to feel safe? The questions reminded him of tracking human fugitives during his sheriff days, when understanding motivation mattered as much as following footprints. Criminals, like animals, followed patterns based on their needs and fears. The key was figuring out what those needs might be. As shadows began lengthening toward evening, Ezra discovered something that made him stop and stare. Nestled in a grove of ancient pines, protected by natural rock walls on three sides, was a small clearing that showed signs of regular use. Not just by Ghostfang, but by the creature's prey animals as well. Deer tracks crisscrossed the area, along with the smaller prints of rabbits and squirrels. Most telling of all were the remains of several meals scattered around what appeared to be a preferred resting spot. Bones picked clean, arranged in neat piles rather than scattered randomly. Hide strips hung from tree branches, apparently being cured for some purpose. This wasn't the lair of a mindless predator. This was evidence of an animal that planned ahead, that prepared for the future, that had established a territory and was actively managing it. Ezra settled behind a large boulder at the edge of the clearing, unwrapped some jerky from his pack and prepared to wait. If Ghostfang used this place regularly, patience might bring the encounter he was seeking. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was applying the same lesson he'd tried to teach Thomas all those years ago. As twilight deepened into full darkness, the forest around him came alive with night sounds. Owls called from distant trees, small creatures rustled through underbrush, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote pack began their evening song. Normal sounds of a healthy wilderness ecosystem. Then gradually, the sounds began to fade. Ezra felt the hair on the back of his neck rise as silence spread outward from somewhere deeper in the forest. Whatever was approaching commanded enough respect or fear to quiet every other living thing in the area. He eased his rifle into position, though he had no intention of using it unless absolutely necessary. The weapon was insurance, nothing more. If his theory was correct, violence would only confirm Ghostfang's apparent belief that humans were threats to be avoided or driven away. A branch snapped in the darkness beyond the clearing. Then another. Deliberate sounds spaced evenly, as if something large was walking without attempting stealth. Either Ghostfang was supremely confident in this territory, or the creature was announcing its presence intentionally. Ezra forced himself to remain motionless, breathing slowly and evenly. Every instinct screamed at him to turn and face the approaching sounds, but he understood that sudden movements could trigger a violent response. Instead, He waited with the patience his son had never had the chance to fully learn. The footsteps stopped at the edge of the clearing. In the moonlight filtering through the pine canopy, Ezra caught his first clear glimpse of the creature that had terrorized Pinewood for 3 years. Ghost Fang stood at the forest edge, motionless as carved stone, studying the human invader in its domain. The reality was both more and less than the legends had suggested. Ghost Fang was magnificent and terrible in equal measure, but not quite the monster of local legend. Standing 4 feet at the shoulder, the creature was indeed massive, with the powerful build of something bred for strength rather than speed. Its coat was darker than Ezra had expected, charcoal grey, shot through with black stripes that would make it nearly invisible in shadows. But it was the eyes that held his attention. Yellow as autumn leaves, they glowed with an intelligence that was unmistakably aware. This wasn't the blank stare of a wild predator evaluating prey. Ghost Fang was studying him with the focused attention of something trying to solve a puzzle. For several long minutes, neither man nor beast moved. The creature's head tilted slightly, and Ezra noticed something that made his heart clench with unexpected sympathy. Ghost Fang was limping, favoring its right front leg. Dark stains around the shoulder suggested an injury that had been festering for some time. Slowly, carefully, Ezra reached into his pack and pulled out a piece of dried venison. Not throwing it, not making sudden gestures, just holding it visible in his open palm. The creature's nostrils flared, catching the scent, but it made no move to approach. "Easy there," Ezra said softly, using the same tone he'd once used to calm nervous horses. "I'm not here to hurt you." The sound of his voice made Ghost Fang's ears prick forward. Another tilt of the head, this time accompanied by a soft whine that spoke of pain rather than aggression. The creature took a single step into the clearing, then stopped, muscles tensed for instant flight. Ezra set the meat on the ground between them and slowly backed away from it. "There you go. Take your time." But instead of approaching the food, Ghost Fang circled the entire clearing, staying near the tree line, studying Ezra from multiple angles. The limp became more pronounced as the creature moved, and Ezra could see that the injured leg was swollen and hot-looking even in the dim moonlight. When the circling was complete, Ghost Fang settled onto its haunches about 20 feet away from both Ezra and the offered meat. The message was clear. It would watch and wait, but it wouldn't be trapped into accepting gifts that might come with strings attached. Smart animal. Too smart for its own good, perhaps. Ezra remained motionless for another hour, letting the creature grow accustomed to his presence. Gradually, the normal night sounds of the forest began to return. Owls resumed their hunting calls. Small creatures ventured out of their hiding places, and the tension in the clearing decreased to something almost companionable. When Ghost Fang finally approached the meat, it did so with elaborate caution, never taking its eyes off Ezra. The creature sniffed the venison thoroughly before taking it in gentle bites. Nothing like the savage tearing that legends had described. Even injured and hungry, it maintained a dignity that spoke of careful upbringing. This had been someone's companion once. Ezra was certain of it now. As if reading his thoughts, Ghost Fang finished the meat and then did something unexpected. It approached closer, within 10 feet, and lay down facing him, head resting on its front paws. The posture was unmistakably that of a dog, seeking approval from a trusted human. "What happened to you, boy?" Ezra whispered. "Where did you come from?" The creature's tail, thick and bushy, gave the slightest twitch at the sound of his voice. Not wagging exactly, but acknowledgement that it was being spoken to rather than shouted at. Ezra spent the rest of the night in the clearing, maintaining his vigil while Ghost Fang dozed fitfully nearby. The creature's sleep was troubled, interrupted frequently by whimpers and involuntary movements that suggested painful dreams. Each time it stirred, those yellow eyes would find Ezra immediately, checking that the human was still in the same position and posed no threat. By dawn, a fragile trust had been established. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would make for exciting stories in Pinewood's saloon. Just two damaged souls, sharing space without violence, each giving the other room to exist. When morning light filtered through the pine canopy, Ezra got his first clear look at Ghost Fang's injured leg. The wound was worse than he'd thought, a deep puncture that had become badly infected, probably from a trap or a bullet that had grazed rather than killed. Without treatment, the creature would eventually succumb to blood poisoning. More disturbing were the other scars he could now see covering the animal's body. Rope burns around the neck and legs, healing cuts that spoke of struggles with wire fencing. Most telling of all, a pattern of small circular scars along the ribs that could only have come from repeated application of something hot. Poker marks, perhaps, or the tip of a branding iron. Someone had tortured this animal, systematically, repeatedly. Ezra's hands clenched into fists as he recognized the signs of deliberate cruelty. He'd seen similar scars on horses that had been brutalized by men who took pleasure in causing pain. The miracle wasn't that Ghost Fang had turned aggressive, it was that the creature had retained any capacity for gentleness at all, as if sensing his change in mood. Ghost Fang raised its head and studied him with those remarkably expressive eyes. The creature seemed to recognize sympathy when it saw it, because for the first time since their encounter began, its tail moved in something that might generously be called a wag. "Someone hurt you bad, didn't they?" Ezra said softly. "Made you afraid of people. Made you think you had to fight to survive." The response was another soft whine, this one carrying a note of something that sounded almost like agreement. Ezra reached slowly into his pack again, this time pulling out his water flask and a clean cloth. "I can help with that leg if you'll let me. Won't be pleasant, but it'll keep you from dying of poison." Ghost Fang watched the preparations with intense interest, but no apparent fear. When Ezra began moving slowly toward the injured leg, the creature tensed but didn't retreat. It had decided, for reasons of its own, to trust this particular human. The cleaning process was difficult for both of them. The wound was deep and angry, requiring thorough irrigation to remove the infection. Ghost Fang bore the pain with stoic endurance, occasionally pressing its massive head against Ezra's shoulder when the discomfort became too much to bear, silently. "Easy, boy," Ezra murmured as he worked, using strips torn from his own shirt to create bandages. "I know it hurts. Sometimes healing hurts worse than the original injury." The words carried more weight than he'd intended. As he wrapped the creature's leg with careful precision, Ezra found himself thinking about his own wounds, the emotional damage that had never properly healed because he'd refused to let anyone help clean them out. When the bandaging was complete, Ghost Fang licked Ezra's hand with gentle gratitude. The gesture was so purely canine, so reminiscent of countless dogs he'd known throughout his life, that Ezra had to swallow hard against an unexpected surge of emotion. "There you go," he said, sitting back on his heels. "That should help, but you're going to need rest and regular care if you want it to heal properly." As if understanding the implications, Ghost Fang settled more comfortably in the clearing, making it clear that it had no intention of going anywhere. At least not yet. Ezra found himself with an unexpected patient and an even more unexpected sense of purpose. 3 days into his vigil with Ghost Fang, Ezra made a discovery that changed everything he thought he knew about the creature's story. While exploring the area around their shared camp, he found something glinting in the underbrush near a rocky outcropping, a piece of rusted metal that made his blood run cold. It was a dog collar, weathered by years of mountain weather, but still intact enough to read the faded brass nameplate, "Rex, property of the Morrison family, if found. Returned to Sweetwater Ranch." Ezra turned the collar over in his hands, noting the deep scratches in the leather where teeth had worried at it desperately. The buckle was bent and broken, suggesting it had been torn off rather than removed gently. Dark stains that might once have been blood marked the inner surface. Sweetwater Ranch. He knew that name from stories told in hushed voices around Pinewood's general store. A family had tried to establish a homestead in the high country about 4 years ago. A young couple named Morrison with their 2 children and a handful of livestock. They'd been ambitious, maybe too ambitious, choosing a remote location that promised good water and grazing, but offered little in the way of neighbors or protection. The story had ended in tragedy. A late spring blizzard had caught them unprepared, and by the time a search party reached their homestead, the family was dead and their livestock scattered to the winds. The official report blamed exposure and poor planning. But Ezra remembered talk of other things found at the scene, evidence of violence that suggested something more sinister than simple weather. "So that's who you used to be," Ezra murmured, looking back toward the clearing where Ghostfang was resting. "Rex Morrison, someone's beloved companion." The creature had lifted its head at the sound of its old name, ears pricked forward with unmistakable recognition. For a moment, something almost like hope flickered in those yellow eyes before being replaced by the careful wariness that had kept it alive for so long. Ezra pocketed the collar and returned to their camp, his mind working through the implications of this discovery. A family dog, traumatized by whatever had happened at Sweetwater Ranch, surviving alone in the wilderness for years. No wonder it had developed such a complicated relationship with humans, caught between instinctive loyalty and learned fear. "Hey there, Rex," he said softly, settling back into his usual spot across the clearing. The name felt right on his tongue, more honest than the fearsome legend of Ghostfang. The creature's response was immediate and heartbreaking. Its tail began to wag. Not the tentative movement Ezra had seen before, but genuine canine joy at hearing its true name spoken with kindness. Rex whined softly and took several steps toward him before stopping, still fighting the conditioning that warned against trusting humans too completely. Over the following days, Ezra worked patiently to build on this breakthrough. He established routines that Rex could predict and find comfort in. Fresh water brought every morning. The infected wound cleaned and rebandaged each evening. Quiet conversation during the long hours of waiting for healing to take hold. The dog's intelligence became more apparent as their relationship deepened. Rex had learned to distinguish between different types of human approach during his years of hiding. He could tell the difference between someone moving through the forest casually and someone hunting him specifically. He understood that raised voices meant danger, but quiet tones meant safety. Most remarkably, he had developed an almost supernatural ability to read human intentions. When Ezra moved too quickly or made sudden gestures, Rex would freeze and study him intently until satisfied that no threat was intended. The dog had learned to survive by becoming a student of human nature. "You're smarter than most people I've known," Ezra told him one evening as he changed the bandages. The infection was responding well to daily cleaning, and Rex no longer flinched when Ezra approached the injured leg. "Probably smarter than me, truth be told," Rex responded by resting his massive head on Ezra's knee, a gesture of trust that felt like a gift. The simple contact awakened something in Ezra that had been dormant since Thomas's death, the protective instinct that had once made him a devoted father and dedicated lawman. But their peaceful routine was about to be disrupted. The 6th day of their partnership, Ezra heard voices echoing up from the valley below. Harsh voices raised in anger, growing steadily closer. Rex heard them too, and immediately assumed the alert posture that meant potential danger. His ears flattened against his skull, and a low growl rumbled in his throat. "Easy, boy," Ezra soothed, but he was reaching for his rifle even as he spoke. Those voices carried the particular tone of men worked up for violence, and he had a sinking feeling he knew what had brought them to the mountains. Through his small telescope, he could see them climbing the steep trail toward their position, 5 men armed with rifles and accompanied by a pack of hunting dogs. At the head of the group was Jake Murphy, the blacksmith from Pinewood, his face set in grim determination. "We know you're up here, Cade." Murphy's voice carried clearly across the distance. "Time's up! That beast nearly killed Tom Henderson's boy yesterday, and folks are done waiting for your fool experiment to work." Ezra's blood chilled. Another attack? But that was impossible. Rex hadn't left the clearing in days, had barely been able to walk on his injured leg. Whatever had happened in Pinewood, this dog wasn't responsible. "There's been a mistake," he called back, stepping into view but keeping his rifle ready. "The animal you're looking for is here with me, and it's been here for almost a week. It couldn't have attacked anyone yesterday. Don't try to protect that monster," shouted another voice, Pete Morrison, the old tracker. "We found fresh tracks right by the Henderson place. Big ones, just like before." Rex pressed against Ezra's leg, trembling with a fear that went deeper than simple anxiety. This was the terror of an animal that had learned to associate groups of armed humans with pain and death. His breathing had become rapid and shallow, and Ezra could feel the powerful muscles bunching beneath the thick fur. "Listen to me," Ezra called out, trying to keep his voice calm and reasonable. "I can prove this dog isn't responsible. Give me a chance to show you." His words were cut off by the sharp crack of a rifle. The bullet splinged off a rock near Rex's feet, sending stone fragments flying. The hunting dogs below began baying with excitement. Sensing that their quarry was near, Rex let out a howl of pure terror and bolted for the tree line, his injured leg nearly buckling under him, but adrenaline carrying him forward. In seconds, he had vanished into the dense forest, leaving Ezra alone to face 5 angry men who were convinced they were hunting a killer. "You fools," Ezra shouted, his own temper finally breaking. "You just drove away the only chance you had of solving this problem." But Murphy and his companions were already spreading out, trying to cut off escape routes and corner their quarry. The hunt that Ezra had hoped to avoid was about to begin in earnest. And now he found himself caught between his promise to the townspeople and his growing attachment to a dog that deserved protection, not persecution. As the sounds of pursuit faded into the forest, Ezra made a decision that would have surprised the hermit he'd been just a week earlier. He was going to find Rex before the others did, even if it meant putting himself between an innocent animal and the justice that humans called necessary. Finding Rex took 2 days of careful tracking through terrain that grew increasingly treacherous. The dog had fled in panic, crashing through underbrush and leaving a trail that even an inexperienced hunter could follow. But as his terror subsided and survival instincts took over, Rex had begun moving more deliberately, choosing paths that would mask his scent and confuse pursuers. Ezra followed the signs with growing respect for the animal's intelligence. Rex was leading the hunting party in circles, doubling back on his own trail, even wading through shallow streams to break his scent line. These weren't the actions of a mindless beast. They showed the calculated thinking of something that had learned to stay alive through cunning rather than strength. When Ezra finally caught up with him, Rex was hiding in a narrow cave, barely large enough for his massive frame. The dog was pressed against the back wall, eyes wild with fear, the carefully wrapped bandages around his leg torn and bloody from his desperate flight. "Easy, boy," Ezra whispered, settling at the cave mouth without trying to enter the confined space. "It's just me." "You're safe," Rex whined softly, recognizing Ezra's voice but too frightened to approach. The trust they'd built over the past week had been shattered by gunfire and the baying of hunting dogs, sounds that clearly triggered terrible memories. Ezra reached into his pack and pulled out his spare shirt, the one he'd been saving for emergencies. Without hesitation, he began tearing it into strips, working slowly so Rex could see that his hands held no weapons. "That leg needs attention," he said conversationally, as if they were still sitting peacefully in their mountain clearing. "Looks like you've torn it open again. Can't have that healing properly if you keep running on it." The familiar routine of preparing bandages seemed to calm Rex slightly. His breathing slowed, and some of the wildness faded from his eyes. When Ezra held out a strip of clean cloth, Rex actually crept forward far enough to sniff it. "That's it," Ezra encouraged. "Just like before. I'm going to take care of you, same as always." The process of rebandaging the injured leg in the cramped cave was awkward and difficult, but Rex submitted to it with the patient endurance Ezra had come to expect from him. As he worked, Ezra found himself talking, partly to keep the dog calm, but mostly because the words seemed to need saying. "I know what it's like," he said softly, cleaning the reopened wound with water from his flask. "Being afraid of people who should have protected you. Having something terrible happen that changes how you see the world. Rex's ears pricked forward at the change in Ezra's tone. Something in the man's voice spoke of shared experience, of pain that ran deeper than physical injury. I had a boy once, Ezra continued. His hands working steadily while his heart opened wounds he'd kept carefully sealed. About the age you probably were when you belonged to the Morrisons. Sweet kid, brave as anything, loved animals more than most people. The words came easier now, as if Rex's quiet presence had given him permission to remember without drowning in guilt. His name was Thomas. Tommy. He had this way of talking to hurt animals, real gentle-like, same way I'm talking to you now. Made me proud to watch him, the way he'd take care of things that needed helping. Rex had gone completely still, as if sensing the importance of what was being shared. His yellow eyes never left Ezra's face, and something in their depths suggested understanding that went beyond simple animal instinct. I failed him, Ezra whispered, the confession torn from somewhere deep inside. Let a bad man get close to our family because I thought I was smart enough to handle any situation. Thought my badge and my experience were enough to keep the people I loved safe. The fresh bandage was in place now, but Ezra's hands remained gentle on Rex's injured leg, the contact somehow necessary for both of them. When it was over, when I found them, his voice broke and he had to stop for a moment to gather himself. I couldn't save them, all my training, all my promises, and I couldn't save the two people who mattered most in the world. Rex pressed closer, his massive head coming to rest against Ezra's chest. The gesture was purely instinctive, the kind of comfort one wounded soul offers another. In that moment, species didn't matter, only the shared understanding of loss and survival. So I ran, Ezra admitted, stroking the thick fur behind Rex's ears. Came to these mountains to hide from what I'd done wrong. Told myself I was protecting other people by staying away. But truth is, I was just scared of failing again. They sat together in the cave's dim interior, two refugees from different kinds of tragedy, finding solace in quiet companionship. The sounds of the hunting party had faded into the distance. Jake Murphy and his men were searching in the wrong direction, following false trails that Rex's desperate flight had created. But I found you, Ezra said eventually. Or maybe you found me. Either way, I'm not running anymore. As if responding to the resolve in his voice, Rex lifted his head and looked directly into Ezra's eyes. What passed between them in that moment was something beyond simple trust. It was recognition. They had both been broken by loss, had both learned to fear the very connections that might heal them, and had both discovered that sometimes salvation came in unexpected forms. The sound of voices in the distance reminded them that their sanctuary was temporary. The hunting party was still out there, still convinced they were pursuing a killer. But now Ezra had a decision to make that would have been impossible a week earlier. He was going to protect Rex, no matter what it cost him. "Come on, boy," he said, gathering his supplies. "We need to get you somewhere safe while I figure out how to prove your innocence." Rex struggled to his feet, still favoring the injured leg, but moving with more confidence than he'd shown since the attack. As they prepared to leave the cave, he did something that stopped Ezra in his tracks. He picked up the torn remains of his old bandages in his teeth and carried them along, as if understanding that evidence of his injury might be important. "Smart dog," Ezra murmured with something that might have been the first smile he'd managed in years. "Smarter than the men hunting you, that's certain." Together, they emerged from the cave into afternoon sunlight that seemed brighter somehow, full of possibilities that neither had dared imagine just days before. The hunt was still on, the danger still real, but they were no longer facing it alone. For the first time since losing Thomas, Ezra felt like he had something worth protecting again. And judging by the way Rex stayed close to his side as they moved through the forest, the feeling was mutual. The wanted poster was nailed to a pine tree like a death sentence, the paper fluttering in the mountain breeze, as if trying to escape its own message. Ezra found it while scouting ahead for safe passage, and the sight of his own face staring back at him from the crude sketch made his blood turn to ice water. Wanted for questioning, Ezekiel Cade, former sheriff of Arapahoe County, last seen in the vicinity of Pinewood, Colorado Territory. Contact U.S. Marshal Service Denver office. Reward $500. Below the main text, in smaller print that made Ezra's hands shake, in connection with the escape of Marcus Kane and subsequent murder of Martha and Thomas Cade, may be armed and considered dangerous. Rex sensed his distress immediately, pressing against his leg with a soft whine of concern. But Ezra barely noticed the comfort being offered. His mind was reeling with the implications of this discovery. After 5 years of hiding, someone had connected the Hermit of Pinewood with the disgraced sheriff who disappeared from Denver. But who? And why now? The answer came in the form of voices approaching through the trees, not the rough calls of Jake Murphy's hunting party, but the measured tones of men accustomed to official authority. Ezra grabbed Rex's collar and pulled him behind a large boulder just as 3 figures emerged into view. The man in the lead wore a brass star on his vest and carried himself with the confidence of someone used to being obeyed. Behind him walked 2 others, one clearly a deputy by his stance and equipment, the other a civilian whose expensive clothes and soft appearance marked him as someone from the city. "This is the area the townspeople described," the marshal was saying, consulting a piece of paper. "If Cade is really up here playing games with that animal, we should find signs soon enough." "I still don't understand why we're pursuing this angle," the civilian complained, dabbing at his forehead with a silk handkerchief. "The man's been a hermit for years. What possible connection could he have to my client's interests?" "Your client hired me to find Marcus Kane," the marshal replied curtly. "Kane's trail went cold after the Denver murders, but there were always rumors that someone helped him disappear. A disgraced sheriff with nothing left to lose would be perfect for that kind of job." Ezra's world tilted sideways. They thought he'd helped Marcus Kane escape. The man who'd murdered his family was being protected by someone wealthy enough to hire federal marshals. And somehow Ezra had become a suspect in his own family's deaths. "The timeline fits," the deputy was saying, apparently warming to the theory. "Cade disappears right after Kane breaks out of custody. Could be they planned the whole thing together. Fake Kane's death, make it look like Cade was another victim. Split the proceeds from whatever jobs Kane's been pulling these past 5 years. Preposterous," Ezra whispered. But even as he said it, he could see how the circumstances might look to outsiders. A sheriff whose prisoner escapes and kills his family, then vanishes without a trace into the wilderness. To men who didn't know the crushing weight of guilt and grief that had driven him into exile, it might indeed look like elaborate deception. "The question is whether this dog business is connected," the civilian mused. "Some kind of signal system, perhaps. Kane uses the animal to communicate with Cade about when it's safe to move stolen goods through the territory." Rex trembled against Ezra's side, picking up on the tension radiating from his human companion. The dog's instincts were screaming that these men represented danger, but he stayed perfectly still, trusting Ezra to decide when action was necessary. "We'll know soon enough," the marshal said grimly. "If Cade really is up here, he can't hide forever. These mountains don't offer that many places to disappear completely, and if he resists questioning..." the deputy asked. The marshal's hand rested casually on his sidearm. "Then we'll assume guilt and act accordingly." They moved past Ezra's hiding place, following a trail that would lead them away from his current position, but inevitably back toward any area where Rex might take shelter. As their voices faded, Ezra slumped against the boulder, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he'd just learned. Marcus Kane was alive. Not only alive, but apparently active enough to require the services of expensive lawyers and federal marshals. The man who'd destroyed Ezra's life had been free all these years, probably laughing at the sheriff, whose mercy had made it all possible. More crushing still was the realization that his self-imposed exile had accomplished nothing. He'd thought his disappearance would spare other families the risk of his failures, but instead it had made him look guilty of crimes that sickened him to contemplate. His grief had been twisted into evidence of collaboration with the very monster he'd sworn to bring to justice. Rex nudged his hand gently, sensing the depth of his despair. The dog's touch brought Ezra back to the present, reminding him that whatever else might be true, he now had responsibilities that went beyond his own guilt and regret. "We're in trouble, a boy," he said softly, scratching behind Rex's ears while his mind worked through their limited options. "Bad trouble. Those men think I'm a criminal, and they won't be interested in hearing explanations." The irony was almost too bitter to bear. After years of avoiding human contact to protect innocent people from his supposed curse of failure, he was now suspected of being in league with the man whose escape had started it all. Every choice he'd made in the name of protecting others had been turned against him. But as he looked into Rex's trusting yellow eyes, Ezra felt something he hadn't experienced in 5 long years. A sense of purpose that had nothing to do with his own guilt or redemption. This dog had already suffered enough at human hands. Whatever happened to Ezra himself, he wouldn't let Rex become another victim of circumstances beyond his control. "Listen to me," he said, his voice gaining strength as his resolve hardened. "Those men are going to keep hunting us both now. They think you're part of some criminal scheme, and they think I'm the mastermind behind it all. That means we can't trust anyone else to help us." Rex's tail gave the slightest wag, as if he understood and accepted the terms of their partnership. Man and dog against a world that had already hurt them both too much. "But I'm not giving up," Ezra continued, surprised by the conviction in his own voice. "Not on you, not on clearing both our names. If Kane's really alive, if he's been active all these years, then there might be evidence that proves what really happened. Evidence that shows you're just an innocent animal and I'm just a broken-down ex-sheriff who never betrayed anyone except maybe himself." The sound of voices in the distance reminded them that their pursuers were still close. But for the first time since losing Thomas, Ezra felt the stirring of something that might eventually become hope. He had a mission now, not just survival but justice. Not just for himself, but for the loyal companion who'd somehow found the courage to trust again, despite every reason not to. Standing up, Ezra folded the wanted poster and tucked it into his pack. Evidence of how far he'd fallen, but also a reminder of what he was fighting to reclaim. His good name, his peace of mind, and the chance to protect something innocent in a world that seemed determined to destroy anything decent it could find. "Come on, Rex," he said quietly. "Time to stop running and start fighting back." Rex rose beside him, still favoring the injured leg, but moving with new purpose. Whatever doubts the dog might have had about trusting humans had been settled by watching Ezra's reaction to their shared danger. If his human was willing to face overwhelming odds rather than abandon him, then Rex was prepared to do the same in return. Together, they disappeared into the forest. No longer refugees, but partners in a cause that neither could achieve alone. Behind them, the marshal and his men continued their search, unaware that their quarry had just transformed from frightened prey into something far more dangerous, someone with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The small wooden whistle felt impossibly light in Ezra's weathered hands, but the weight of memory it carried threatened to crush him. He'd carved it from a piece of mountain ash during Thomas's 4th winter, when his boy had developed a troublesome habit of wandering off during their evening walks around their Denver neighborhood. "One long whistle means come running," Ezra had explained, teaching his son to recognize the clear, piercing note. 2 short ones mean you're going the wrong direction. 3 quick ones mean stop where you are and wait for Papa. Thomas had been so proud of that whistle, treating it like a sacred communication device between father and son. He'd practiced the signals until he could identify each one from remarkable distances. And Ezra had never once blown a call that his boy didn't answer immediately. Now, sitting in a hidden cave 2 miles above Pinewood, with Rex pressed against his side, Ezra wondered if the whistle might serve a similar purpose with his new companion. The dog had shown remarkable intelligence and adaptability. Perhaps he could learn to respond to the same signals that had once guided a beloved child. "What do you think, boy?" he asked softly, holding the whistle where Rex could examine it. "Think you might like to learn some new tricks?" Rex sniffed the carved wood with interest, his tail giving the slightest wag. Something about the object seemed to intrigue him, maybe the familiar scent of Ezra's hands, or perhaps some deeper understanding that this small tool represented communication rather than threat. The past 3 days had been a careful dance of evasion and preparation. The marshal and his men had established a systematic search pattern, working their way through the mountains with the methodical precision of experienced manhunters. They'd found and destroyed Ezra's original camp, scattered the hunting party that had been pursuing Rex, and made it clear that they had no intention of leaving without their quarry, but they were tracking a ghost. Ezra had learned these mountains intimately during his 5 years of exile, and Rex knew every game trail and hidden shelter from his own years of survival. Together, they'd stayed one step ahead of their pursuers, while Ezra developed a plan that might clear both their names. The key was proving that someone else was responsible for the recent attacks near Pinewood. If Rex had been with Ezra during the incidents that had reignited the townspeople's fears, then another animal was doing the damage. And if another animal was involved, it meant someone was deliberately using the Ghostfang legend to cover their tracks. But proving innocence required evidence, and gathering evidence meant taking risks that could get them both killed. "All right," Ezra said, raising the whistle to his lips. "Let's see if you're as smart as I think you are." He blew one long, clear note, the same call that had once summoned Thomas home for supper. Rex's ears pricked forward immediately, and he tilted his head with obvious interest. When Ezra patted the ground beside him, the dog moved closer, studying his face for clues about what was expected. "Good," Ezra murmured, scratching behind Rex's ears. "That means come close. Let's try the next one." 2 short blasts brought a different response. Rex looked around uncertainly, then took a few steps toward the cave entrance. When Ezra shook his head and repeated the signal, the dog returned to his side, beginning to understand that the sounds were instructions rather than random noise. The 3 quick notes proved the most challenging. Rex had no frame of reference for stopping and waiting. His survival had depended on constant movement and vigilance. But after several repetitions, he began to grasp that the signal meant freezing in place until told to move again. "You're a natural," Ezra said with genuine admiration. "Smarter than most recruits I trained during my sheriff days." The whistle training continued through the afternoon, with Rex proving remarkably quick to learn and eager to please. By evening, he was responding to all 3 signals with confidence, treating the exercise as a game rather than work. His tail wagged with genuine enthusiasm each time he got a signal right, and he clearly enjoyed the praise and attention that came with success. But the real test would come when they moved into dangerous territory. As darkness settled over the mountains, Ezra began his final preparations for what might be their last night of freedom. His plan was simple in concept, but perilous in execution. Sneak back toward Pinewood under cover of darkness. Find evidence of the real creature causing the recent attacks, and somehow present that proof to authorities who were convinced he was a criminal. The risks were enormous. The marshal's men would be watching every approach to the town, equipped with the kind of resources that made capture likely and escape uncertain. Worse still, if Ezra was wrong about there being another animal involved, he'd be walking Rex directly into a trap with no way out. But doing nothing meant accepting guilt for crimes neither of them had committed. And Ezra had spent 5 years learning that some forms of safety came at too high a price for his conscience to bear. "Listen to me carefully," he said, his hands working methodically as he checked his rifle and loaded his pack with essential supplies. "Where we're going tonight is going to be dangerous. More dangerous than anything we've faced so far." Rex watched these preparations with the focused attention he'd learned to give Ezra's more serious moments. Something in the man's tone told him this wasn't another training exercise or routine movement to a new hiding place. "There are going to be men with guns looking for us," Ezra continued, speaking as much to organize his own thoughts as to prepare his companion. Men who think we're criminals and won't hesitate to shoot first and ask questions later. If something happens to me, if we get separated, or if I tell you to run, you use everything you've learned these past years to disappear into these mountains and stay hidden." The dog's tail stopped wagging, and his yellow eyes grew solemn. He'd learned to read human emotions with uncanny accuracy, and he could sense the weight of what Ezra was contemplating. "But if everything goes right," Ezra said, forcing optimism into his voice that he didn't entirely feel, "we might be able to prove that you're not the monster everyone thinks you are. Maybe even prove that I'm not the traitor they think I am." He tucked the whistle into his shirt pocket, close to his heart, where he'd once carried a photograph of Thomas and Martha. The symbolic gesture wasn't lost on him. He was carrying hope again, fragile and precious as a child's toy, but real enough to fight for. "The whistle signals work for close range," he explained, patting the pocket. "But if we get separated and I can't get close enough to call you, watch for other signs. And signals, things that look natural but aren't. You're smart enough to figure them out." Rex pressed closer, as if sensing this might be their last quiet moment together for a while. His massive head rested on Ezra's knee with the same trusting weight that had first broken through the mountain man's carefully constructed walls. "I want you to know," Ezra said quietly. His voice thick with emotion, he'd thought himself incapable of feeling anymore. "That these past weeks with you have been the first time I've felt human since I lost my boy. Whatever happens tonight, you gave me that gift. You reminded me what it feels like to have someone depending on me, someone worth protecting." The words hung in the cave's dim interior like a benediction, blessing the unlikely partnership that had transformed them both from broken survivors into something approaching whole again. When they finally emerged into the starlit night, Ezra felt the familiar weight of his rifle across his shoulders and the comforting presence of Rex at his side. They moved through the darkness with the synchronized precision of a team that had learned to trust each other completely, heading toward a confrontation that would either restore their names or end their story forever. Behind them, the cave that had been their sanctuary stood empty, holding only the lingering warmth of the bond that had been forged within its protective walls. Ahead lay Pinewood, and the answers that might finally set them free if they could survive long enough to find them. The whistle rested against Ezra's heart, silent for now, but ready to carry the voice of protection and love across whatever dangers the night might bring. Just as it had once called a small boy home to safety, it would now guide a loyal dog through the darkness toward something that might, with courage and luck, finally resemble justice. Together, man and beast descended toward their destiny, no longer running from their past, but moving deliberately toward the confrontation that would define their future. The ambush came at dawn in Devil's Canyon, a narrow pass where ancient rock slides had created a maze of boulders and blind corners. Ezra had chosen the route precisely because it offered multiple escape options, but he hadn't counted on his pursuers being smart enough to split their forces and seal both ends of the canyon simultaneously. The first shot cracked like thunder in the confined space, the bullet striking sparks off granite inches from Ezra's head. Rex immediately dropped into the defensive crouch that had kept him alive through years of persecution, his yellow eyes scanning for threats while his powerful muscles coiled for action. "Ezekiel Cade!" The marshal's voice echoed off the canyon walls, distorted but unmistakably authoritative. "You're surrounded! Drop your weapons and surrender yourself for questioning." Ezra's response was to work the lever of his Winchester, chambering around with the practiced motion of a man who'd once worn a badge and understood the language of violence. 5 years of self-imposed exile hadn't dulled his reflexes or his accuracy, skills that had made him one of Colorado Territory's most respected lawmen before his world collapsed. Questioning about what? He called back, using the echo effect to mask his exact position among the scattered boulders. "About crimes I didn't commit? About helping the man who murdered my family? Drop the weapon, Cade. We know about your arrangement with Marcus Kane. We know about the stolen goods you've been moving through these mountains. The accusation hit Ezra like a physical blow, but it also clarified something that had been nagging at him since finding the wanted poster. They weren't just hunting a suspected criminal. They believed he was an active participant in whatever Cain had been doing for the past 5 years, which meant Cain was definitely alive, definitely operating in the region, and probably responsible for far more than just the deaths in Denver. Another shot rang out, this one coming from a different angle. Ezra counted at least 3 distinct positions based on the muzzle flashes, the marshal and his deputy he'd seen before, plus reinforcements they must have called in from other jurisdictions. Professional manhunters with experience and equipment that made this fight anything but fair. Rex moved beside him with the fluid grace of a predator, understanding without words that they were under attack, and that flight rather than fight would be their best option. But as they prepared to retreat toward what Ezra hoped was still an open escape route, the dog suddenly froze, his ears pricked forward and a low growl rumbling deep in his chest. "What is it, boy?" Ezra whispered, following Rex's intense gaze toward a cluster of rocks about 50 yards up the canyon wall. The answer came in the form of movement, not the careful positioning of human hunters, but the flowing approach of something that belonged in these mountains. Something large and dark that moved with predatory purpose through terrain that should have been impossible to navigate. Another ghost fang, or rather the real one. The creature that emerged from concealment was everything the legends had claimed and more. Larger than Rex, with a coat so dark it seemed to absorb light, and eyes that glowed with a malevolent intelligence that made Ezra's blood run cold. This wasn't a traumatized family pet that had learned to survive in the wilderness. This was something that had chosen violence as a way of life. Jesus. One of the marshal's men breathed, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. What the hell is that thing? The real Ghost Fang studied the scene below with obvious calculation, taking in the positions of all the humans before fixing its attention on Rex. What passed between the two animals in that moment was something primal and unmistakable, the recognition of territorial rivals who could not coexist peacefully. "Easy, Rex," Ezra murmured, but he could feel the tension building in his companion like a coiled spring. Every instinct the dog possessed was screaming that this other creature represented a threat that had to be confronted. The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but the marshal's deputy chose that moment to shift position for a better shot at Ezra. The movement caught the real Ghost Fang's attention, and its response was swift and terrible. The creature launched itself from its perch with no warning, covering the 50-yard distance in bounds that seemed to defy physics. Its target wasn't Ezra or Rex, but the nearest human, the deputy who'd been careless enough to expose himself in the open. The man's scream cut through the canyon like a blade, followed immediately by the sharp crack of breaking bone and the wet sounds of flesh being torn. The marshal's shouts for covering fire were answered by wild shots that ricocheted dangerously off stone walls, adding chaos to an already desperate situation. It was Rex who broke the paralysis that had gripped Ezra. The dog exploded from their hiding place with a roar that seemed to shake the canyon walls, launching himself at the creature that was savaging the deputy, not fleeing from violence as his traumatic past should have dictated, but charging toward it in defense of beings who had been hunting him just moments before. The collision between the two animals was like the meeting of opposing storms, full of fury and desperation and the kind of primal conflict that predated human civilization. As they rolled and snarled and fought among the scattered boulders, Ezra realized with crystal clarity that Rex was outmatched. The real Ghost Fang was larger, stronger, and driven by a killing rage that Rex's gentle nature couldn't match. His companion, his friend, was going to die unless Ezra acted immediately. For the first time in 5 years, Ezra Cade raised his rifle with the intention of killing another living creature, not for survival or justice, but for love. The shot that changed everything came from Ezra's Winchester, fired with the cold precision of a man who'd spent 20 years enforcing justice in violent country. The bullet took the real Ghostfang in the shoulder, spinning it away from Rex with a snarl of pain and fury that echoed off the canyon walls like the voice of hell itself. But instead of fleeing or falling, the wounded creature turned its attention to this new threat, fixing its burning yellow eyes on Ezra with the kind of focused hatred that spoke of intelligence and memory. This wasn't just an animal defending territory. This was something that understood revenge. Rex struggled to his feet, blood streaming from deep gashes along his flanks where the other creature's claws had found their mark. His injured leg buckled under him, but he forced himself upright through sheer determination, positioning himself between Ezra and the advancing predator. "Get back, boy," Ezra commanded, working the Winchester's lever to chamber another round. But Rex ignored the order, his own growl rising to match the rumbling threat coming from their enemy. The real Ghostfang circled them with the patient, stalking behavior of an apex predator, apparently unconcerned by its own wound. Dark blood matted its coat, but the injury only seemed to have increased its rage rather than weakening its resolve. When it finally attacked again, it came not for Rex, but directly for Ezra, recognizing him as the more dangerous opponent. Ezra's second shot went wide as he threw himself sideways to avoid massive jaws that snapped shut where his head had been just moments before. He hit the rocky ground hard, feeling his ribs protest the impact, but managed to roll behind a boulder as claws raked the stone where he'd fallen. The creature's frustrated roar was answered by Rex's defiant bark as the injured dog launched himself at his tormentor from behind. The impact sent both animals tumbling in a confusion of fur and fangs, but this time Rex was ready for the fight. His weeks of healing had restored much of his strength, and more importantly, he was fighting to protect rather than simply survive. The battle between the two animals was fierce but brief. Rex had size and intelligence on his side, but the real Ghostfang fought with the vicious desperation of something that had nothing left to lose. When they separated this time, both were bleeding, but it was Rex who was favoring a new injury, a deep puncture wound in his neck that leaked crimson onto the canyon floor. "Rex!" Ezra's cry of anguish carried more pain than any of his own physical injuries. The sight of his companion's blood triggered something primal in him, a protective fury that swept away 5 years of careful emotional numbness. He rose from behind his boulder like an avenging spirit, the Winchester steady in his hands despite the chaos around him. This time when he fired, the bullet found its target with devastating precision, taking the real Ghostfang center mass and dropping it to the stone with a wet thud that echoed through the canyon. The silence that followed was deafening. The marshal and his surviving men had gone quiet, apparently stunned by the violence they'd just witnessed. Rex stood swaying over his fallen enemy, his breath coming in harsh gasps while blood dripped steadily from his wounds. "Drop your weapon, Cade." The marshal's voice was hoarse but still carried authority. "It's over. Drop the rifle and step away from the animal." Instead of complying, Ezra walked slowly toward Rex, his hands empty but his eyes never leaving his wounded companion. The dog's legs gave out just as he reached him, and Ezra caught the massive animal in his arms, feeling the warm wetness of blood soaking through his shirt. "Easy, boy," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I've got you. You're going to be all right." But even as he spoke the reassuring words, Ezra could see that Rex's injuries were serious. The neck wound was deep, and blood was pooling beneath them faster than should have been possible. Without immediate medical attention, his companion wasn't going to survive. "Help us," Ezra called out to the hidden lawman, all pretense of resistance abandoned. "This dog just saved your deputy's life. The least you can do is help me save his." "Step away from the weapon first," came the shouted reply. Ezra looked down at the Winchester lying beside him, then at Rex's fading eyes, and made the easiest decision of his life. He kicked the rifle away, sending it clattering across the stone. "There! Now help us, damn you!" The marshal emerged from concealment first, his own weapon drawn, but pointed downward. What he saw when he reached them apparently convinced him that the immediate threat had passed. A bleeding man holding a dying animal, both of them surrounded by evidence of a battle that had nothing to do with criminal conspiracy and everything to do with love and loyalty. Jesus. "Cade," the marshal said quietly, holstering his pistol. "What the hell happened here?" "Justice," Ezra replied simply, pressing his hands against Rex's wounds in a desperate attempt to slow the bleeding. Finally, from Rex's neck hung the torn remains of a bloody bandage, the last remnant of the care Ezra had given him, now stained with the price of protecting those who would have destroyed him. The fabric that had once been a symbol of healing had become a badge of sacrificial courage, worn by a dog who'd proven that sometimes the greatest strength comes from choosing to love, despite every reason to hate. As consciousness faded from Rex's yellow eyes, his tail managed one final weak wag, not in pain, but in the simple joy of knowing he was not alone. 3 months later, autumn painted the Colorado Territory in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Ezra of better days. He sat on the porch of his new cabin, larger than the old one, with room for more than just solitary survival, watching Rex chase fallen leaves with the enthusiasm of a dog half his age. The scars from their final battle had healed well, leaving only faint silver lines beneath his dark coat and a slight stiffness in his gait when the weather turned cold. The new collar around Rex's neck was a work of art, braided from the finest leather Ezra could find, and decorated with small silver conchos that caught the morning sunlight. It wasn't a tool of restraint, but a symbol of belonging, crafted during the long weeks of recovery, when both man and dog had learned to trust in the possibility of better days. "Rex Morrison Cade," Ezra said aloud, testing the weight of the name they'd settled on. It honored the dog's original family while acknowledging the new bond that had been forged in blood and sacrifice. Rex's ears perked up at the sound, and his tail began the enthusiastic wagging that had become such a welcome part of Ezra's daily routine. The official vindication had taken time, but it had been complete. The real Ghostfang's body had yielded evidence that connected it to a series of livestock killings across 3 territories. Attacks that had occurred while Rex was documented to be in Ezra's care. More importantly, the creature's lair had contained trophies from its victims, including items that proved its responsibility for the original Morrison family tragedy. Rex had been cleared of all charges officially and publicly. The townspeople of Pinewood had held a ceremony in his honor, with little Sarah Henderson presenting him with a hand-stitched blanket that he treasured above all his other possessions. Dr. Patterson had declared him a hero of the First Order, and even Jake Murphy had grudgingly admitted that he'd been wrong about the dog's character. Ezra's own exoneration had been more complex but equally thorough. The federal investigation, triggered by the Canyon battle, had uncovered a network of corruption that reached back to Denver and involved several officials who'd been protecting Marcus Kane in exchange for a share of his criminal proceeds. Kane himself had finally been captured in a raid on his hideout near the Utah border, ending a reign of terror that had lasted far longer than anyone had imagined. The wanted poster that had started it all now hung framed on Ezra's wall, not as a badge of shame, but as a reminder of how thoroughly truth could triumph over appearances when good people were willing to fight for it. Below, it hung his old sheriff's badge, offered back to him by a grateful territorial government that had learned the value of honest lawmen the hard way. He'd declined the offer politely but firmly. That part of his life belonged to the past, along with the guilt and isolation that had defined his years of exile. The future held different responsibilities, gentler ones that suited the man he'd become through learning to love again. The sound of approaching horses drew his attention to the trail that led up from Pinewood. Mayor Williams was riding in the lead, followed by Tom Henderson and his daughter Sarah, all of them wearing the kind of smiles that meant good news. Rex bounded toward them with welcoming barks, his transformation from feared beast to beloved town mascot complete in every detail that mattered. "Morning, Ezra," Mayor Williams called as he dismounted. "Beautiful day for what we came to discuss. And what might that be?" Ezra asked, though he suspected he already knew. They'd been dropping hints for weeks about a proposition that would benefit everyone involved. "The school board has approved our recommendation," Sarah Henderson announced, before any of the adults could speak. At 11 years old, she'd grown into a confident young lady whose brush with danger had only strengthened her natural courage. "We want Rex to be our official school guardian." The position they were offering was unprecedented, but perfectly logical. Rex would live at the schoolhouse during the week, protecting the children and serving as both companion and teaching aid for lessons about nature and responsibility. Weekends would be spent with Ezra, maintaining the bond that had saved them both, while allowing Rex to fulfill his natural protective instincts in a way that served the community. "What do you think, boy?" Ezra asked, kneeling beside his companion. "Want to be a school dog?" Rex's enthusiastic tail wagging suggested he understood the importance of the offer, even if the specific details were beyond his comprehension. What mattered was that the people who'd once feared him now trusted him with their most precious possessions, their children. "There's one condition," Ezra said, rising to shake hands with the delegation. "Anytime there's trouble, any hint of danger to those kids, you send for me immediately. We're a team now, Rex and I. What threatens one of us concerns both." The agreement was sealed with handshakes and promises, but more importantly, with the understanding that some bonds transcend species and circumstance. As the visitors prepared to leave, Sarah Henderson approached Rex with the careful respect she'd learned to show all animals. "Large and small. Thank you," she whispered into his ear, her small arms wrapped around his massive neck. "For being brave when we needed you to be." Rex's response was to gently lick her face, a gesture so tender that it brought tears to the eyes of every adult watching. This was redemption in its purest form, not just forgiveness for past mistakes, but the chance to transform those mistakes into wisdom that served others. As evening shadows lengthened across their mountain sanctuary, Ezra and Rex settled on the porch for their customary end-of-day reflection. The wooden whistle rested in Ezra's pocket, no longer needed for training, but treasured as a bridge between the love he'd lost and the love he'd found again. In the distance, the lights of Pinewood began to twinkle like earthbound stars, each one representing a family that now slept safely because two broken souls had learned to heal each other. It wasn't the ending either of them had expected when their paths first crossed in that moonlit clearing, but it was the ending they'd earned through courage, sacrifice, and the willingness to trust in second chances. Sometimes the most unlikely partnerships produce the most extraordinary results. Sometimes redemption comes not from running away from the past, but from learning to transform its lessons into gifts for the future. And sometimes, in a world that often seems determined to break good hearts, love finds a way to win.